last night on the Ireland Contracting Nightly Sports Call.
Let's talk about some football. I want to get into something particularly right now because it's something that's happening at the moment. Baltimore on the road facing San Francisco, the night game for the Christmas NFL slate, which is still something I'm getting used to saying, the Christmas NFL slate. But Baltimore leading San Francisco 30-12 in a game where Baltimore, I believe going in, was a 6-point underdog. And right now they're up 18 points on San Francisco. Here's why this game I thought would be interesting, because you're talking about the two top scoring defenses in the league. Baltimore being the number 1 scoring defense and San Francisco being the number 2. Also, these are two teams that the Steelers have faced. They beat Baltimore at home and lost big to San Francisco at home. And that tells you a lot just about how this league can be on any given day, because we look at some of the games that the Steelers have lost and then you remind yourself, hey, the team that could come out of tonight with the top record in the league lost to the Steelers a couple weeks ago, or I should say almost a couple months ago. That's something that sticks out. But here's another reason why it's important. Baltimore with a win tonight will improve to 12-3. That will further their gap as the number 1 seed in the AFC, which means a win tomorrow, or not tomorrow, a win next week against Miami, that wraps up the number 1 seed. That wraps up home field advantage for the Ravens. And that makes the final game of the season against the Steelers a lot more interesting, because if the Ravens do wrap up home field advantage, if they do have that number 1 seed, that game against the Steelers becomes meaningless. So what happens? They'll probably rest Lamar Jackson. They'll probably rest some of their starters that either are playing hurt or they want to make sure they don't get injured going into the playoffs, which means the Steelers' path might get a little bit easier, and they didn't even have to do anything to get there. This is important because, yes, the Steelers go into Seattle next week and they got to beat the Seahawks on the road. They have to win out in order to make the playoffs. However, their path continues to open up in front of them as far as getting outside help. Besides Baltimore beating Miami and possibly making that end of the deal easier, you're also talking about a situation if Miami loses to Baltimore next week, then Miami has to play the final game of the season against Buffalo with the AFC East Division Championship on the line. So if Miami loses their next 2 games, Buffalo will win the AFC East Championship, and that means Miami gets bumped down to a wild card team, and the Steelers probably won't make the playoffs. However, if Baltimore beats Miami next week and Miami beats Buffalo in the final game of the season to win the AFC East, then Buffalo would likely be below the Steelers, and Buffalo gets knocked out of the playoffs. This is why all this stuff that we're talking about right now is important when we're talking about the Steelers' playoff chances. Plus, there's a whole crazy situation going on in the AFC South since Jacksonville lost, and Indianapolis lost, and Houston lost. Now you got a 3-way tie for first place in the AFC South. If 2 of those teams lose at least once in the next couple weeks, the Steelers' path to the playoffs becomes a little bit easier. So all of this is kind of crazy when you break it all down. But this is what we're looking at as far as the Steelers' chances of making the playoffs and how all this stuff is very much interconnected, which is why it was important why they won that game against Cincinnati on Saturday night. That was important as well. So all of it is interconnected. The tiebreakers are interconnected. That loss to Indianapolis, it looked really bad before the end of the day yesterday, and then after yesterday, it doesn't look so terrible. There's still some things that can work in the Steelers' favor to get them into the playoffs. Granted, yes, you probably shouldn't lose to a team like that in that setting. That's not what I mean. I mean, as far as hurting their playoff chances, it looks a lot worse ahead of time, but now maybe not so much. But the bottom line is, the Steelers, if they win their next 2 games, their chances are pretty great. And they have a lot of good opportunity to get some outside help to get them into the playoffs. I know some people may not want that to happen given the state of this team. And that's a good possible argument to make against it. But the truth of the matter is, with this league, you're talking about almost a dozen teams that have between 7 to 9 wins. There's a lot of teams right there in the middle of the league that are just trying to fight their way in to get to the playoffs, because there's 4 or 5 teams that are at the top of the league, 2 or 3 that are hanging on the outside, and then a bunch that are right there in the middle. And the Steelers are right there in that cluster. So these games do add up to how much of a chance they have to get into the AFC playoffs. For our GMC Sierra tweet of the night comes from Dave Richard, I believe is the name. Aiden O'Connell's second half stats, 0. In case you didn't watch the Raiders and the Chiefs earlier today, Aiden O'Connell started at quarterback for Vegas. He completed 9 passes in the first quarter of that game against Kansas City. He did not complete a single pass after the first quarter of that game against Kansas City. Yet the Raiders won 20-14. It's one of the weirdest things you will hear. It's probably one of the weirdest stats you will probably see this season. But that happened in a game in 2023 in the NFL against, of all teams, the Kansas City Chiefs. But for the record, Vegas in that game, their defense was absolutely phenomenal. They had a touchdown off a fumble recovery, had a touchdown off an interception. Kind of sound like the Steelers in the early part of the season, how they were doing the same thing against other teams. But yeah, Aiden O'Connell's second half stats, absolutely insane. 412-575-2600 is the number. Give us a call. Want to hear what you have to say about this Steelers situation coming up here. Mason Rudolph, Kenny Pickett. Who's your quarterback these last 2 games of the season? Give us a call on the Bordas and Bordas hotline. Sean on Twitter says, Steelers moving forward with 2 games remaining. Mike Tomlin should stick with Mason Rudolph at quarterback. The team just looked different. Plus, you don't know if Kenny Pickett is 100%, and you know what he gives you under center. That's where I am at this right now. Until you know for absolute certain that Kenny Pickett is 100%, I would stick with Mason Rudolph, and not until not a moment before Kenny Pickett is 100%. And not to mention the fact you've seen what you've gotten out of Kenny Pickett at 100%. Now, here's why I can't look at one game for Mason Rudolph, because Mason Rudolph did that yesterday or 2 days ago against Cincinnati. Kenny Pickett's best game this season was also against Cincinnati in Cincinnati. So I can't sit there and try to make an apples-to-apples comparison of what the 2 quarterbacks have done, because Mason Rudolph faced, if not the worst defense in the league, definitely the worst defense in the AFC. So at this point, as long as Kenny Pickett is not 100%, I'm going with Mason Rudolph. I agree with Sean. Rodney in Pitcairn wants to talk about quarterbacks as well. Rodney, you're on the Nightly Sports Call.
Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Appreciate
Happy holidays.
You. Merry Christmas.
Got a quick question for you, and I just want to get your pick on this. I agree with you about Mason being the quarterback. I don't see that being a problem. But I wanted to ask you, I noticed that I saw Cleveland play a couple days ago where they used DTR and they used it Flacco in certain play situations where you can use both quarterbacks. I don't know if Tomlin's opposed to that, and everybody's talking about, well, Tomlin said at one point he was going to use Kenny Pickett because he is the starter, but you can play both. Is there a possibility of doing that? Is that something you think they would do? And what's your take on that? I'll hang up and let you finish and talk.
This is where we're 100% honest and candid with ourselves. If Mike Tomlin puts Mason Rudolph and Kenny Pickett on the field at the same time and that play does not work, you know how many calls I'll get on this show if that happens? I would not do it. I wouldn't even consider it. I don't think it's a good idea. For 2 reasons. 1, you don't know how that play is going to turn out, for starters. 2, Kenny Pickett is not Dorian Thompson-Robinson. They're not the same kind of quarterback. I don't think they have the same kind of athleticism. I don't think you're going to get the same kind of result. I would strongly recommend against it. I guess that's the best way to put it. And that's nothing against Mason Rudolph or Kenny Pickett. It's just neither of those guys are Dorian Thompson-Robinson. Neither of those guys do what DTR can do, whether it was in the college game or even in the pro game. I think that's a very special wrinkle that Cleveland has the luxury of doing, and I don't think the Steelers have that luxury. Now, if you wanted to sell me on the thought of maybe with Mitch Trubisky, I'd think about it for maybe 15 seconds, and then I'd probably come to the same conclusion. I can't bring myself to just come out and say, yeah, try it. No, not with those 2. I can't do it. Another question on Twitter. If you were the Steelers in the offseason, would you bring back Quan Alexander but also draft a linebacker, or would you use the draft to bring in players and use free agency to fill out the coaching staff? I would bring back Quan Alexander if he's willing to come back, and also draft a linebacker. If Quan Alexander's not willing to come back, I'd talk to Miles Jack about coming back if he's willing to do it. I think the fact that he's healthy, and he said as much after the game against Cincinnati, Miles Jack being healthy this season as opposed to that groin injury he was dealing with last year, I think the results are a lot different. So if you can't get Quan Alexander back, get Miles Jack back maybe as a plan B or a backup plan, but definitely draft a linebacker in this upcoming draft. I don't think you can go with the current arrangement, which is Cole Holcomb, Landon Roberts, both of which are under contract next season, and then hopefully you get Quan Alexander back or a Miles Jack. I don't think that could last you longer past next year. I think it's something that's good for a short-term deal. It's not something I would expect to happen year over year repeatedly. I think that's just really playing with fire, especially given the situation you've seen with the linebackers already this season. Alexander already being out, Holcomb already being out, Roberts' status probably being in doubt for Seattle. So I would definitely try to bring Quan Alexander back, and if you can't, bring back Miles Jack. Definitely draft a linebacker. You need to start looking toward the future as to what this defense is going to be and who's going to lead it. Because what's been the issue with this linebacking core, with those injuries? Who's the green dot guy? Who's the guy that's getting the plays from the sideline and is calling the plays? You need to know what your future linebacking core is going to look like so you can start answering that question of A, who your green dot guy is now, who your second green dot might be, and in the case of this season and a few years ago when they had a bunch of linebackers injured, who your third green dot linebacker is going to be, because all those things definitely come into play at the same time. Dave in Verona, you're on the Nightly Sports Call.
Merry Christmas, Josh.
Merry Christmas, Dave.
Okay, I just wanted to bring up a point more than anything.
Okay.
Is that just a couple of years ago, you'll probably remember when the name Mason Rudolph played. I think it was Detroit, or was it the Browns?
Detroit. I believe it was 2020.
Okay, and who did they – the point being, they were winless. They tied the game, I believe.
Yeah, so 16-16 tie. Yeah.
They wanted to drop him right there. Like, these fans wanted to drop him right there. And now, all of a sudden, he plays one good game, and now he's the savior. Now, I mean, personally, I like Mason Rudolph. I like Kenny Pickett. I like everyone because I want everyone to succeed as a Steeler. But do people forget that they wanted him hanging off the Holton Bridge?
Yeah, they forget that. They forget that completely. Here's one thing I've noticed, Dave, and thanks for the call. There's this thing that people do where they like to rewrite history. I got some colleagues that like to do this. It's Christmas. I don't care. I'm just going to come out and say it. There are people who like to rewrite history. There are people that will tell you as recently as 2 years ago that they thought Mason Rudolph should not be on the roster. And now, after one game against one of the worst defenses in the league, they're telling you that Mike Tomlin should have played Mason Rudolph sooner. And you bring this up to them, and they act like it's not important and it's not a problem, and they're just able to bounce back and forth. No. We see you, we hear you, and we know what you said previously. And that's just not my own colleagues. That's people in this fan base as well. Here's my own personal thought process on this. I have personally never hated Mason Rudolph. I've never thought Mason Rudolph wasn't at least a capable quarterback to be on an NFL roster. I've always felt that he was. That tie that we're talking about against the Lions a couple years ago, that really was not his fault. They had 2 fumbles in overtime. One, I believe, was Deontay Johnson. I believe the other one was Pat Freiermuth. But Mason Rudolph, for the most part, did his job somewhat well, or at least passably, to help that team win the game. I felt like people burying him then was not fair. I feel like people trying to blame Mike Tomlin for not playing him sooner now is not fair. Mason Rudolph being a backup on this team, I think, makes perfect sense to me. When you get him in the opportunity to be the guy, when you lose somebody else and you put him in, he comes in and performs. That's what you expect a backup quarterback to do. That's what I think he fits in perfectly within this team. And I think he has his exact role the way it needs to be.
And if you want to get your opinion heard, don't forget to tune in to the Ireland Contracting Nightly Sports Call tonight at 10:35 on KDKA+. So give us a call at 412-575-2600. We do it every night after the 10 o'clock news. For CBS News Pittsburgh, I'm Josh Taylor.